An entire army reached the sea and still did not know if it would live. Dunkirk was not born as a clean miracle, but as a crowded beach filled with smoke, cold water, abandoned guns, and men staring at ships that might never come close enough. Behind them, German forces pressed forward. Above them, aircraft waited for targets. Ahead of them, the channel looked less like a road home than another place to die. Tonight, we step onto that grey sand with the British soldiers who learned that survival could feel almost as heavy as defeat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you had stood with me on the beach at Dunkirk, you might not have understood at first that an army was close to disappearing. There was no grand announcement, no moment when someone said it had broken. There was only smoke behind us, the grey sea in front of us, and long lines of men standing waiting for the world to decide whether we would live. I remember looking at the water and feeling that the road had ended. By then, we were not thinking like soldiers in an operation. We were thinking like tired men with wet socks, throats, heavy packs, and eyes that kept searching the horizon. Men looked for ships. Someone checked whether a friend was still nearby, and we tried not to stare too long at the smoke rising from the town. Strategy had become a word for other people. For us, survival had shrunk into small questions. Whether there was water left, whether the boots would hold, whether the next shape on the sea was coming toward us or away. Strangely, some of it still looked ordinary. Men adjusted straps, rubbed sand from their eyes, sat down carefully to save strength, and stood again when an officer moved along the line. A man could be trapped at the edge of Europe and still worry about the blister on his heel. That detail stays with me. Behind us, France had folded under a speed most of us had not imagined. The German advance through the west had cut deep and fast, and the British, French, and other Allied troops in the north were pressed back toward Dunkirk until the sea became less like a route home and more like the last wall of a room. Roads had been cut off, units separated, orders changed, and vehicles abandoned when fuel or time ran out. None of it came to us as a clean map. Dunkirk would later be called an evacuation, and people would speak of it with a kind of brightness that made it easier to remember. Standing there, it did not feel bright. It felt like an army had been swept into a corner and told to wait while the enemy found the door. It is almost absurd how a man can still stand in a proper line while wondering whether the whole army beside him is about to be erased. The beach itself offered almost nothing. It was wide, flat, open and pale under a heavy sky. There were men everywhere, rows of helmets, coats stiff with salt and sweat, faces grey from tiredness, rifles held because a soldier keeps hold of what proves he is still a soldier. The sea lay ahead of us, cold and indifferent. The thing that might save us was also the thing we could not cross by ourselves. I had imagined retreat as movement, a column going somewhere, even if that somewhere was behind the line. But on that beach, retreat became stillness. We were not advancing, not fighting properly, not sleeping, not eating, not even hiding. We were simply waiting in a place too exposed for comfort and too crowded for panic. The body does not understand history in such moments. It understands thirst first, then cold, then the ache in the legs, then the terrible habit of listening for aircraft. If a man says he was brave there, perhaps he was. I mostly remember being quiet. Fear had gone past shouting and settled into the muscles. It sat in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the way men looked at the sky. The smoke behind us made the beach feel smaller than it was. Dunkirk town, the port, the roads, and the warehouses seemed to be turning into one dark background against which we stood too plainly. Some believed a proper system was working somewhere beyond our sight. Ships were being gathered, officers were giving orders, and men were trying to make sense of the impossible. What mattered was the distance between my boots and the water. It was not a large distance, yet it held everything. Behind that line of sand were the roads we had lost. Ahead of it were the ships we could not command. A modern person might imagine evacuation as buses, lists, loudspeakers, and harsh but visible order. But for us it was a grey shore where thousands of men stared at the same empty water and tried not to think about being left there. I remember the boots most clearly. Boots sank slightly into wet sand. Boots whitened by salt. Boots cracked from marching. Boots belonging to men who had expected to move forward with an army and were now facing the sea like refugees in uniform. That detail made the whole thing feel shamefully human. We had rifles, uniforms, ranks and flags somewhere behind the story, but the beach reduced us to feet, thirst and waiting. The worst part was not that we had lost ground. Soldiers understand losing ground, even if they hate it. The worst part was realizing that the ground had become useless to us. Fields, roads, villages and bridges had narrowed into a strip of coast. We had not run out of rifles. We had run out of land. That thought did not arrive as a speech. It arrived while I stood there with salt drying on my trousers and smoke in my nose, watching the line ahead barely move. It arrived when a man asked whether any boat had come close enough yet, and no one answered. I find it hard to think of Dunkirk as beautiful, because the first thing it gave us was not hope, but the knowledge that even an army can be cornered like a single frightened man. Still, men waited. That is what armies do when there is nothing else left that will not destroy them faster. We waited because discipline survived a little longer than confidence. Somewhere beyond the smoke and water, someone might still be trying to reach us. Dunkirk began with a beach where a trapped army stood between black smoke and cold water, no longer sure whether it was part of a campaign or merely a crowd waiting to survive. Before we reached that sand, the retreat had already worn us down on the roads of France, where men still tried to believe they were falling back in order. The dreadful truth was that many of us had marched past abandoned trucks, broken guns and empty crossroads with not yet understanding that every tired step was pushing us closer to the sea. I dragged my feet along a French road that had already begun to look abandoned by everyone who once trusted it. Trucks stood at odd angles beside ditches, some with doors hanging open, some blackened by fire, some simply empty because there was no fuel left to make them useful. My pack pulled at my shoulders, my mouth was dry, and the men around me walked with their heads lowered, as if the road itself had become too heavy to look at. No one could say clearly where we would stop. At first it still felt like a retreat with some kind of order behind it. Officers moved along the column. Men were told to keep going, and now and then someone pointed toward the next village or the next bend in the road, as if direction alone could mean safety. We had been trained to obey movement, and movement gave the mind something to hold. A soldier can keep walking long after he stops believing. The strange thing was how ordinary the ruin looked after a few hours. A lorry in a ditch became just another lorry in a ditch. A field gun left beside a wall became part of the scenery. A dead horse, a broken cart, a helmet in the mud. All of it passed by in pieces because no one had the strength to stop and understand the whole picture. The army was shedding its weight one object at a time. We did not think of the Ardennes in grand military language while we were on that road. We only felt the result of it. The Germans had come through places many men had believed would slow them, and their advance had cut deep enough to make the northern armies feel suddenly less connected to everything behind them. Lines on maps had been broken before most of us understood what those lines had meant. We learned it through our feet. When a truck ran out of fuel, men climbed down and walked. When equipment could not be moved, it was left where it stood. When orders changed, the column bent into another road and kept moving because standing still felt worse than going the wrong way. It is almost cruel how an army can look organized from a distance, while every man inside it is quietly wondering whether anyone truly knows where they are going. Dust clung to our faces, mixed with sweat, and made everyone look older. Some men had not slept properly. Some had eaten almost nothing. The water in my bottle was nearly gone, and I remember shaking it once, hearing the small sound inside, then saving it because thirst becomes a kind of arithmetic when you do not know how long the road will last. Every swallow had to be argued over. Still, we tried to keep the column together. That mattered more than pride. A broken line of men could turn into a crowd, and a crowd could turn into panic faster than any officer could repair it. We had rifles, but rifles did not solve hunger, confusion, or the feeling that the enemy was moving faster than thought itself. Victory was no longer on anyone's lips. The villages we passed seemed caught between daily life and collapse. Curtains hung in the windows. A bicycle leaned against a wall. A garden gate stood open, and beside it a military vehicle burned slowly enough that it almost looked patient. We moved through those places as strangers who had brought disaster with us but could not stay long enough to explain. The road did not belong to anyone anymore. At times a rumour moved faster than the column. Someone said the line was holding ahead. Someone else said the Germans had cut another road. A third man said there would be transport soon, though no one could say where it would come from. A modern person might imagine a retreat as arrows on a screen, but for us it was a sore throat, a blistered heel, and the sick feeling that every rumour might be the last useful thing we heard. The worst part was that nothing collapsed all at once. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, control thinned slowly. A missing truck here, a lost unit there, a road blocked, a bridge uncertain, a message late, a village passed without pause. Each small problem could be explained by fatigue or bad luck, but together they began to say something darker. We were not retreating toward a strong base. We were being narrowed. The roads we took did not feel like roads home. They felt like channels, pushing us along with less room on either side. Men still asked where the next halt would be, but the answers grew shorter. Some officers looked at maps with the same tight faces as the rest of us. I remember seeing a gun crew leave their piece beside the road. They took what they could carry and walked away from the metal thing that had made them feel useful. No one laughed, no one cursed loudly, no one made a speech about sacrifice. They simply joined the moving line, suddenly lighter and somehow smaller. I find that image harder to forget than smoke or shouting, because it showed how defeat often arrives not as one loud blow, but as men quietly leaving behind the tools that once gave them purpose. By the time the road bent again, my feet had gone dull. I could feel the straps cutting into my shoulders more than the ground beneath me. The men ahead were grey with dust, and the men behind looked no different. We were still an army, but the army felt less like a weapon and more like a long, tired body trying not to fall apart. Then came the sound from above. At first, it was only a low vibration, almost hidden under boots and engines and distant fire. Men began to look up, then look for ditches, trees, walls, anything that might make a body smaller. The road, which had already felt unsafe, suddenly felt open in a new and terrible way. The retreat had begun as a march through dust, empty vehicles, and orders that still pretended the army was moving with control. But the roads of France were no longer only roads behind the front, because the enemy had learned how to reach down from the sky. Soon, every man in the column would discover that the worst sound on a retreat was not boots on gravel, but German engines dropping lower over a road with nowhere to hide. The sound of engines above us made the whole column hesitate before anyone gave an order. Men who had been dragging their feet a moment earlier suddenly looked for ditches, walls, trees, carts, anything low enough to make a body seem less visible from the sky. I remember dropping beside a road bank with my cheek close to the dirt, feeling stones press into my face while my pack twisted under me. Nobody wanted to look up. On the road there was nowhere proper to hide. We were not inside a fortress, not under concrete, not protected by a roof strong enough to mean anything. A village wall might stop a glance, but it would not stop a bomb. A ditch could hold a man flat, but it could not promise he would still be whole when the engines passed. That was the worst part of it. In a firefight, at least a man could point his rifle somewhere. He could curse, aim, crawl, shout, or pretend his hands still mattered. Under the aircraft, the body became small and stupid. You pressed yourself into the earth and waited for machines to decide how close death would fall. The German planes did not feel like distant pieces of a larger campaign. They felt personal once they came low over the road. The noise grew until it filled the skull, and then the world narrowed to the strip of mud in front of my eyes. Men stopped being a column and became scattered shapes along the ditches. It is almost insulting how quickly a trained soldier can be reduced to a man trying to have become flatter than the ground beneath him. When the first explosions landed farther down the road, the dust rose in a hard brown wall. I could not see the men in front anymore. Something cracked, something burned, and someone shouted for a stretcher before the sound was swallowed by the engines. A truck that had already been slow and useless became a burning obstacle across the lane. The retreat grew tighter. We had been told to keep moving, and movement had been the one comfort left. Aircraft took even that away. Every time the engines returned, the road broke apart again, men diving away from the line, officers trying to gather them back, wounded accomplices as no one could safely reach at once. A march could survive tiredness. It could not easily survive the sky turning against it. The fires made everything worse. Vehicles burned where they stood, and smoke drifted across the road until men coughed and stumbled through it with watering eyes. Ammunition, fuel, and panic did not belong together, yet the retreat kept forcing them into the same narrow spaces. A modern road blocked by traffic can make people angry after an hour, but our traffic jams were made of burning lorries, wounded men, and the knowledge that another aircraft might come before the way cleared. I remember one man trying to pull another from beside a wheel that had twisted under a truck. He bent low, worked fast, and kept looking up as if the sky were a door someone might open again at any second. No one had time to be gentle. The wounded were lifted, dragged, or left briefly with promises that someone would come back. Some promises were honest when spoken, and impossible minutes later. That was the cruelty of the air attacks. They did not only kill, they rearranged the living into confusion. A section that had marched together for hours could lose each other in one dive toward a ditch. A man could stand up after the engines faded and find that the road looked the same, but his place in it had vanished. Orders had to be repeated, names had to be called, the column had to become a column again. I began to understand why men looked older after each attack. It was not only fear, it was the effort of being frightened, recovering, standing, lifting the pack again, and pretending the next mile was still possible. The mind had to rebuild itself every time the aircraft left. I find it hard to call that courage in the grand way people like, because much of it was simply exhaustion being forced to continue. The sky stayed grey, but it no longer felt empty. Every cloud seemed to hide a sound. Every distant vibration made shoulders tighten. Men walked with their eyes lowered, then raised them suddenly, then lowered them again, as if looking too long might invite the planes back. The road no longer belonged to our feet. It belonged to whatever appeared above it. By then, we knew the aircraft were not only hunting the roads, they were striking the places we needed most: the port, the beaches, the ships, the narrow points where escape had to gather. The same terror that scattered us beside French fields would be waiting at Dunkirk too. There would be no safe edge to reach. The road retreat taught us that fear could come from above, break a column apart, and leave burning vehicles where men had been trying to keep order. That same air power was already turning toward the one place every trapped soldier needed, the port of Dunkirk. Soon, we would see that the harbour meant rescue only until the bombs began falling on the cranes, warehouses, and ships that were supposed to carry us home. I first saw the port through smoke, and for a moment I wanted to believe the smoke meant activity rather than ruin. Cranes rose above the harbour like dark frames against the grey sky. Warehouses sat half hidden behind drifting black clouds, and the shapes of ships appeared and vanished as if the whole place were breathing badly. Men around me looked toward it with the same hungry attention they gave to water or food. We had reached the place that was supposed to save us. The trouble was that escape needed a place to happen. A ship could not simply collect an army from a thought. It needed a harbour, a pier, a ladder, a gangway, a channel, a few minutes without bombs, and enough order for men to move from land to deck without crushing each other. That sounds simple when spoken calmly. At Dunkirk, every one of those small requirements became a fragile thing. The Germans understood it too. They did not have to destroy every man on the beach if they could destroy the way out. A port was not only buildings and metal. It was the throat through which the army had to pass. It is almost bitterly funny that the one place we all stared at with hope was also the one place any sensible enemy would try hardest to smash. I watched smoke rise from places that should have meant rescue: the docks, the warehouses, the cranes, and the approaches to the harbour were not background details anymore. They were pieces of our survival, and each explosion made them look less reliable. Men stood in loose groups, waiting for instructions, but everyone could see the same thing. The door was burning. The bombing of the port changed the mood in a way that was different from the attacks on the road. On the road, fear scattered us. At the harbour, fear trapped itself inside the chest because there was nowhere sensible to run. The very place we had been moving toward now looked like a target painted large enough for the sky to read. Hope did not vanish all at once. It was damaged in sections. Some ships still came in, and men still tried to board where they could. That made the scene more painful, not less. A working ship or a usable pier could pull the eye like a miracle, and then smoke would drift over it, or another blast would make men flinch and crouch, and the miracle would look temporary again. A modern person might think of a port as an organised place of tickets, ramps, announcements, and timetables. But for us it was twisted metal, shouted orders, smoke in the mouth, and the fear that the next bomb would close the only exit left. The damage forced everything to slow down. Men who had believed they were close to leaving had to wait longer. Large ships could not always come in where they were needed. Some routes became too dangerous, some points too damaged, and some groups had to be moved toward the open beaches or toward makeshift ways of reaching smaller craft. The army had arrived at the doorway and found it breaking apart. I remember seeing shapes in the water near the harbour, pieces of wood, oil, torn material, and things I did not want to name. The sea did not look clean. It carried the port's wreckage back toward us like proof that even escape could be wounded. Men stared at floating debris with a dull expression, because after enough destruction, the mind begins to accept every new ruin as expected. There was a kind of cruelty in the waiting. We could see enough to know that ships existed, but not enough to know whether one would reach us. We could hear enough to understand the port was being attacked, but not enough to know which parts still worked. Every delay felt personal, though it was caused by fuel, choitide, damage, orders, smoke, and enemy aircraft. I find it hard to remember that harbour without feeling the old weight in my stomach, because it taught us that hope could stand right in front of us and still be completely out of reach. The officers tried to keep men moving where movement was possible. Lines shifted, groups were redirected, some men cursed quietly, but most simply followed because there was no better plan available to an ordinary soldier. You did not argue with a burning harbour. You went where you were pointed and hoped the next place was less exposed. That was how the beach began to matter in a new way. At first, the beach hadn't seemed the way we waited before the real rescue began at the port. Then, the port's danger pushed more of the burden onto the sand and the water beyond it. The open shore, which had looked useless because it had no walls and no cover, became part of the only remaining answer. But the beach did not comfort us. It was wide and bare, and a man standing on it felt as visible as a mark on paper. There were no proper shelters, no strong roofs, no harbour structures to hide behind, only lines of men, wet sand, shallow water, and the long wait for boats that might or might not come close enough. The port had been dangerous because it was valuable. The beach was dangerous because it was empty. I looked once more toward the burning harbour and understood that rescue would not arrive in the clean way we had imagined. There would be no simple march onto safe decks, no neat exit from France, no moment when the army passed through a solid gate and left danger behind. We would have to spread out across the coast and wait in the open, where the sky could still find us and the sea could still refuse us. The port of Dunkirk showed us that the road to safety could burn just as easily as any battlefield, leaving men to watch the very machinery of rescue twist in smoke. When the harbour became too damaged and too dangerous to trust, more of us were pushed toward the wide beaches, where waiting itself became a kind of punishment. Out there, thousands of men would stand in long lines on flat sand with almost nothing above them, while every German aircraft had the easiest target in France beneath its wings. The line of men stretched across the sand until it stopped looking like a line and began to look like part of the beach itself. Everyone kept a small pocket of silence around him, as if silence might make the bombs fall somewhere else. Helmets dipped, shoulders sagged, rifles hung from tired hands, and the sea waited ahead of us with no hurry at all. We were not resting. The beach had none of the comfort that word usually carries. There were no chairs, no shade, no walls, No place to close your eyes and feel hidden for even a minute. Sand worked into boots and socks. Wind pushed grit against faces, and every man kept watching the same few directions. The sea for ships, the sky for aircraft, the officers for signs that the line might move. Waiting became work. To leave, we had to stand in order. That was the strange rule of survival at Dunkirk. A man who wanted to live had to keep his place, hold his nerve, and trust that the men ahead of him would move only when told. If the line broke, the beach could become a crush of frightened bodies faster than any boat could save us. It is almost cruel that a man could be close enough to see the water and still be told that his best chance of living was to stand still. There were so many of us that the mind struggled to count. British, French, and other Allied soldiers had been pressed into the Dunkirk pocket, and now hundreds of thousands of men were gathered around the beaches and approaches, waiting for evacuation under a sky that never felt friendly. From a distance, perhaps we looked like order. From inside the line, we felt like exhaustion arranged in rows. The beach was too wide. That was the thing I kept thinking. A field at least had hedges, ditches, barns, or trees, but this place opened itself to the air with a kind of terrible honesty. When engines sounded, there was nowhere proper to go. Men crouched, flattened themselves, or bent their heads as if a steel helmet and a few inches of lowered posture could bargain with a falling bomb. Sometimes the line moved a little, and hope passed through us like a physical thing. Men lifted their heads, adjusted their packs, stepped forward, then stopped again. A few yards could feel like progress, and then the waiting returned heavier than before. The sea seemed close enough to touch and too far away to mean anything. Every pause made the distance larger. Thirst made the hours longer. Some men had almost no water left, and others had learned not to drink too quickly, because no one knew when more would come. Hunger sat quietly beside it, not always sharp, but steady enough to weaken the temper and the legs. Sleep was broken into moments too shallow to help. The body became a list of complaints. The weather added its own punishment. It could be cold near the water, then harsh when the light pressed down, then cold again when wet clothing clung to the skin. Men stood with trousers heavy from damp sand and seawater, coats stiff with salt, hands raw from straps and rifle wood. A modern person might think of a beach as a place for summer idleness, but ours was a bare waiting room where every grain of sand seemed to hold another minute of fear. What made the waiting worse was seeing how little choice existed. You could not simply walk away from the line. Behind us were roads, smoke, German pressure, broken equipment, and the ruins of retreat. Ahead of us were boats that could not take everyone at once. The sides offered nothing but more exposed sand, and more men who looked just as trapped as you. Some tried to talk in low voices, but conversations often died quickly. There was only so much a man could say when everyone was thinking the same thing. Would the ships come? Would the aircraft return first? Would the line move before dark? Would someone behind us be forced to hold longer so we could stand here waiting? The questions did not need answers to do damage. I remember watching a group ahead step into shallow water, and even that looked less like rescue than another stage of punishment. They lifted rifles and packs higher, trousers darkening as the sea climbed around their legs. From behind they looked almost calm, but no one waiting on the sand believed calm anymore. Calm was only what fear looked like when it had become tired. There were wounded men near the lots too, some sitting, some lying, some trying not to make noise, because everyone already knew there was not enough help. That sight made the beach feel less like an evacuation point, and more like a place where all kinds of suffering had been sorted into rows. The healthy stood, and waited. The hurt lay and waited. Everyone waited. I find it hard to explain how a beach can feel crowded and lonely at the same time, but Dunkirk managed it because each man stood among thousands and still carried his own private fear of being the one left behind. You could see faces everywhere, yet no face could promise you a place on a boat. You could hear orders, but no order could promise that the next attack would miss. We were together, and still each man was trapped inside his own counting of minutes. As the hours passed, the beach changed men. It rubbed away the idea that rescue would feel clean or simple. We no longer imagined stepping neatly onto a ship and being carried home. We began to understand that every stage would demand another small surrender, another wait, another cold stretch of uncertainty. Even the sea, which had looked like the way out, began to look like another obstacle standing between us and England. The line ahead moved again, and this time the men did not stop at dry sand. They went down toward the water, slow and stiff, stepping into the shallows with rifles held high. I watched the sea take them up to the knees, then higher, and suddenly understood that reaching the water did not mean reaching safety. It meant standing in a colder line. The beach wore us down by making thousands of trapped men wait in the open, hungry, thirsty, and visible beneath a sky that could turn violent at any moment. From that sand, the only way forward was into the water, where boats waited too far out, and every step became heavier than the last. Men who had already survived roads, bombs, and burning harbour smoke would have to stand waist-deep in the freezing sea, too close to rescue to leave, and too cold to know if their legs would hold. Cold water entered through the cloth first, then through the skin, then into the bones in a slow and patient way. My trousers grew heavy almost at once, my socks filled, and the leather of my boots seemed to tighten around feet that no longer felt mine properly. I stepped forward because the men ahead stepped forward, and because turning back to the sand would have meant admitting that even the sea was stronger than us. After a while, I could not tell whether my feet hurt or had gone numb. The ships were visible, but visibility was not a rescue. Some sat farther out, large enough to carry men away, yet too far from the shallows to reach without help. The beach shelved awkwardly. The water did not offer a clean path, and many of the larger vessels could not simply come in close, like something from a neat harbour picture. We had to wait for smaller boats, or wade out in groups, or stand in the cold while someone decided who could move and when. That was the small cruelty of Dunkirk. You could see the thing that might save you, and still be trapped by the distance between your chest and the boat's side. A few dozen yards of water could become a country of its own, full of cold, waiting, and fear. It is almost ridiculous that after being driven across roads and bombed from the sky, a man could be stopped by water deep enough to freeze his legs, but not deep enough to carry him home. The men around me held rifles over their shoulders, packs high, helmets low, and faces set in that hard, blank look soldiers wear when the body is complaining too loudly to ignore. No one wanted to drop anything, even when every object became heavier. A rifle that had been a weapon on land became a burden in the sea. A pack that had already bruised the shoulders now pulled backward with wet weight. The water kept climbing when the ground dipped. At the knees it was miserable. At the thighs it was frightening. At the waist it began to feel personal, as if the sea had hands and had decided to hold us there. Men shifted from one foot to another, but every movement stirred more cold into the clothing. Standing still hurt, moving hurt, and there was nowhere dry to rest. A small boat came close enough for the men ahead to stir with hope. The movement passed through the line like a rumour made visible. Everyone leaned slightly forward without meaning to, as if the body could arrive before the order did. Then the boat took only a handful, turned away, and left the rest of us standing exactly where we had been. The sea closed around the space. That happened again and again. A craft would approach, men would be called, someone would climb or be hauled in, and the rest of us would the boat move off toward a larger ship or disappear among other shapes on the water. No one could blame the boat. It could only take what it could take. A modern person might think rescue begins the moment help comes into sight. But at Dunkirk, help could float in front of you while your legs shook under cold water, and your name was not called. Waiting in the sea changed the mind differently from waiting on the sand. On the beach, the body was tired, but still belonged to solid ground. In the water, every minute took something. Warmth left first, then strength, then patience, then the small confidence that you could stay upright as long as needed. Men grew quieter, not because they were calm, but because talking spent energy. I watched one man ahead of me try to adjust his pack and nearly lose his balance. 2 others caught him under the arms before he went down. They did it quickly, without drama, and then all 3 stood still again, water slapping against them as if nothing had happened. That was how danger often looked there. Not spectacular, just one tired body, nearly tipping into a worse fate. The sea was not deep enough to drown everyone at once, yet it made every weakness more dangerous. A wounded man could not stand there long. A feverish man shook harder. A man with a bad foot found each hidden dip in the sand. Even the healthy began to move like old men. I find it hard to remember the water without remembering the shame of helplessness, because we were close enough to city and still could do almost nothing but endure the cold. The officers and sailors tried to bring order to the edge of it. They called groups forward, held others back, waved men away when a boat was full, and pushed the whole strange machine of evacuation one small load at a time. To an outsider, it may have looked slow. From inside the water, it felt slower than any clock could measure. Every man believed he could wait a little longer until he began to doubt it. The cold also made fear quieter. Men did not have the strength to panic properly. They watched the boats, watched the sky, watched the faces of those being called forward. Sometimes a man was close enough to touch the side of a craft, and still had to wait while another group moved first. That kind of delay could feel more painful than distance. It made rescue seem governed by rules too cold to argue with. I began to understand that Dunkirk had its own order, and that order did not care how badly a man wanted to live. It cared about lines, space, boat capacity, tides, timing, and whether a craft could make another run. A man could be brave, obedient, frozen, and desperate, and still not be chosen for the next crossing. The water taught us that survival was not only about courage. It was a turn, a chance, and a room. By then, my legs felt separate from me. I kept my hands tight on my rifle, more from habit than usefulness, and stared at the small boats as they rose and dipped ahead. Each time one came nearer, the men around me seemed to breathe without sound. Each time it filled and pulled away, something inside the line sank lower than the water. The cold sea slowed the escape by turning every yard between the beach and the boats into another test of strength, patience, and luck. But even in the water, rescue did not come simply to the man who wanted it most, because Dunkirk still followed a hard order of lines, calls, and limited space. The next cruelty was standing close enough to hear men being chosen for boats, while knowing that your own frozen body might have to wait through another load, another aircraft, and another stretch of water. No one wanted to stand at the back of the line, but everyone understood what would happen if the line broke. The beach was already too full of tired men, wounded men, thirsty men, and men who had listened to aircraft engines too many times in too few days. A few shoves, a few desperate runs toward a boat, and the whole place could turn from an army into a crowd. That was the fear. We had been trained for discipline in barracks, on parade grounds, and on roads where an officer's orders still seemed to belong to a normal world. Dunkirk made that discipline feel different. It was no longer about smart movement or proper appearance. It was about not crushing the man in front of you because you were afraid he might take the last place on the last boat. The line moved in small amounts, then stopped, then moved again. Men watched the officers' hands, the movement of boats, the faces of sailors, the position of stretcher cases, and the water beyond the sand. No one wanted to be told to wait. Everyone was told to wait. It is almost cruel that the thing holding us together was not heroic courage, but the simple act of not stepping out of line while death still had plenty of room to find us. There were moments when I could feel the line tightening. A boat came closer, someone ahead was called forward, and the men behind shifted without meaning to. Shoulders leaned, boots scraped, a few heads lifted too quickly. Then an officer raised an arm, or simply stared hard enough, and the movement settled back into place. That was how close panic lived to order. It did not need much invitation. Hunger, cold, smoke, and fear had already done most of the work. A man did not have to be a coward to want to move first. He only had to be tired enough to believe that waiting one more turn might kill him. Still, most men stayed where they were. They did it because the man beside them stayed, because the officer in front of them still expected it. After all, some last piece of soldiering had survived even when so much else had been stripped away. On that beach, discipline was not clean or noble. It was strained, ugly, necessary, and very thin. But it held. The wounded made the order harder to bear. Some sat near posts or wooden markers, wrapped in coats, faces pale under dirty bandages. Others lay on stretchers or on sand, flattened by passing boots. A healthy man could tell himself that waiting was fair until he looked down and saw someone who could not stand, could not argue, and could not force his way forward even if the beach collapsed around him. That was when fairness became painful. Some stayed, some were helped toward boats, because they could no longer walk properly. Some watched them go and felt relief, shame, envy, and guilt all at once. A modern person might imagine a queue as an inconvenience, but our queue was a line between the living and the left behind, and every place in it felt heavier than a number. The officers had an impossible task. They had to keep men calm without promising what they could not control. They had to choose movement without making the men still waiting feel abandoned. They had to send groups forward while holding back others who were just cold, just as frightened, and just as desperate to leave. A single wrong push could have undone hours of effort. I remember one officer near the water, his uniform wet almost to the waist, waving men forward in small groups. His face had the flat look of someone who had stopped wasting energy on expression. He did not comfort anyone. He did not explain more than necessary. He counted, pointed, stopped, and began again. That kind of order saved men, but it also hurt men. It made each person see exactly how limited rescue was. A boat that could carry a few could not carry all. A line that protected the many could feel merciless to the one man who had reached the edge of his strength. Dunkirk survived on patience, but patience was being pulled out of exhausted bodies. There were sounds that tested it constantly. Engines in the distance, a burst of shouting near another line, a rumour that a boat had filled too quickly, a sudden movement toward the water. Every man heard these things and measured them against his own fear. The line was not calm, it was controlled fear standing upright. I find it unsettling to remember how close we came to becoming dangerous to one another, not because we hated each other, but because every man on that sand wanted the same narrow chance to live. That is the part people often soften when they speak of order. Discipline did not remove terror. It only gave terror a shape that could be managed for a little longer. As the hours passed, I understood that the line was a kind of agreement. No man had signed it, but everyone depended on it. I would not break past the man ahead, and the man behind would not break past me. In return, we all pretended that the system would hold long enough for our turn to come. That agreement was fragile because it was built on trust. At the very moment trust should have been hardest. We trusted that boats would return. We trusted that officers were not lying. We trusted that the men, Gardereggers and villagers behind us would keep the Germans away long enough for the line to mean something. Without them, all our discipline would have been only a neat arrangement for capture. The beach could hold its order only because other men were still buying time inland. We could stand in rows because someone behind us was holding a road, a bridge, a village, or a broken defensive line against pressure we could not see from the water. Each quiet minute on the sand had a cost somewhere else. We did not always know who was paying for it. The line on the beach kept us from turning into a frightened crowd, and for a while that thin discipline helped move men toward the boats one group at a time. But the order we clung to existed only because other soldiers were still standing between us and the German advance. Behind the sand, men we could barely see were holding roads and villages with the terrible knowledge that every minute they won for us might be a minute stolen from their own escape. Waited on the beach for ships, while somewhere behind us other men were still holding roads, villages, bridges, and broken lines that most of us could no longer see. That was the part that sat heavily in the mind once a man understood it. The sand, the sea, the boats, and the lines in front of us were only possible because somebody else was still facing the German advance inland. Our waiting had a shield behind it. At first, the thought came as a rumour. Someone said French units were still fighting near the town. Someone else said British troops were holding a road long enough for another group to reach the beach. A third man mentioned a bridge, a village, a defensive line. But none of the names meant much to us by then. We only understood that time was being bought. Time sounded harmless when officers spoke of it. Hold for another hour. Keep the road open, delay the enemy, protect the evacuation. On paper, those words looked clean enough. In the body of a man ordered to hold ground while others moved toward boats, they meant something much colder. It is almost cruel how easily the word delay can hide the fact that some men were being asked to spend their own chance of escape so others could keep theirs. I tried to picture them behind us. Men pressed into houses with shattered windows, lying behind brick walls, crouching near roads with smoke drifting across fields. Men looking toward the same sky, we feared, but with the added knowledge that the enemy was not only above them, but also coming along the ground. They were still soldiers in the older sense, facing forward while we faced the sea. Without those rear positions, the beach might have collapsed into panic. If the Germans had reached the evacuation area too quickly, all our lines, all our waiting, all those careful movements toward boats could have turned into a slaughter or a mass capture. The men at the perimeter were not part of the pretty picture people later liked to imagine. They were the reason the picture could exist at all. Some of them knew exactly what their orders meant. They had to hold long enough, not necessarily return safely. Their job was not to be rescued first. Their job was to prevent the rest of us from being trapped before the ships could take us. A Masonic person imagines sacrifice as a dramatic choice made in one shining moment. But at Dunkirk, it could mean sitting behind a wall in a ruined French village and knowing every minute you held might move someone else closer to England while moving you farther from it. That knowledge made the beach feel different. A boat arriving no longer meant only rescue. It also meant that somewhere behind us, men had held long enough for that boat to matter. Every time the line moved, someone inland had given us time. Every time an officer waved another group forward, someone else had kept the enemy from turning that movement into useless chaos. I remember hearing firing from far away, or what I thought was firing. At Dunkirk, distance changed everything. Sounds came through smoke, wind, engines, and fear, so a man could never be sure what he heard. Still, the mind filled in what the eyes could not see. A village under shellfire, a roadblock under pressure, a bridge held until it could no longer be held. There was guilt in it, though no one knew what to do with that guilt. We wanted the rear units to hold because our lives depended on it. We also knew that wanting them to hold meant wanting them to remain in danger. That is not a clean emotion. It does not fit well into speeches about courage. The French soldiers especially stayed in my thoughts, though I did not know their names. Many of them fought around the perimeter, while British troops waited for ships, and many would not be remembered as clearly in the story told later. At the time, we did not have the luxury of fairness. We had only the fact that men behind us were still fighting. I find it hard to remember the boats without also remembering the unseen men who made those boats possible. Because rescue for one man can be built from the ruined chances of another. On the beach, some men spoke of them in short sentences. They are still holding. They are catching hell back there. They will be all right, someone said, though no one believed any such thing with confidence. The words were not meant to explain the war. They were meant to make waiting bearable. That is how the perimeter entered our lives. Not as a clear map, but as pressure behind the ribs. We stood in lines because others stood in doorways, ditches, crossroads, and damaged streets. We hoped for ships because they accepted the risk of delay. We wanted to live, and their task was to give us enough time to try. Some of those men would be wounded. Some would be captured. Some would die with the sea still miles away, while those of us on the beach complained of cold water and slow boats. That did not make our fear false, but it made it smaller in a way I did not like. Dunkirk was full of men suffering differently in the same disaster. By the time another boat came in, I could not look at it as simply a boat anymore. It was a result. It was the visible end of invisible fighting. The men who climbed aboard did not always know who had bought that moment for them. I did not know either, not truly. The men on the perimeter gave the beach its narrow chance by holding roads, villages, and bridges long enough for the evacuation to continue. From the sand, we often saw only the ships arriving, not the men behind us who were being wounded, captured, or killed to keep the Germans away. When the next large vessel appeared offshore, many of us would stare at it with hope, without knowing that a ship big enough to save hundreds was also big enough to become a burning target in front of everyone still waiting. A large ship offshore could make the whole line fall quiet. Men who had been shifting in the water or staring down at their boots would lift their heads and look toward it with a hunger that was almost painful to see. A ship meant decks, space, movement, England, and the possibility that the waiting might finally end. it also meant the sky would notice. That was the cruel balance of Dunkirk. The bigger the ship, the more men it might carry away, and the more hope it gave to everyone still standing on the sand. But size also made it visible. It drew the eye of every soldier on the beach, and it drew the eye of every aircraft hunting for something worth destroying. A small boat could slip in and out like a nervous animal. A large ship could not hide from anyone. I remember watching one vessel beyond the shallows, dark against the grey sea, with men already moving toward it in small craft. For a few moments it seemed impossible that such a thing could fail us. It looked too solid, too heavy, too much like an answer. It is almost foolish how quickly men can hand their hope to a shape on the horizon, even when that shape is large enough for the enemy to see from miles away. The problem was simple and terrible. A ship that could save hundreds could also lose hundreds. If it were filled with men and then came under attack, rescue could turn into another disaster in the time it took a bomb to fall or a fire to spread. Men who had waded through roads, beaches, cold water and lines could still be thrown back into the sea, with oil, smoke, splintered wood, and other men struggling around them. We knew ships had been hit. Some had been damaged, some sunk, some forced away, and some never reached the men who were waiting for them. News came in pieces, carried by sailors, officers, rumours, and the sight of smoke itself. A vessel burning offshore did not need explanation. Everyone understood what it meant. When aircraft appeared above a ship, the beach seemed to hold its breath. We were too far to help and too close to look away. Men crouched out of habit, though the bombs were not meant for the sand that time. The ship became the whole world for a few seconds. Then came the blast, the splash, the black smoke, or the awful pause before anyone knew whether it had been hit. A damaged ship changed the line behind it. The men waiting did not need an officer to tell them hope had been pushed back again. You could feel it pass through the beach, shoulders dropped, faces hardened. Some men stared longer than they should have, as if looking might pull survivors out of the smoke. A modern person might imagine rescue vessels as symbols of safety, but at Dunkirk, a ship could become a coffin so large that thousands watched it die from the shore. The small boats around the larger ships had their own misery. They moved between beach and vessel, between shallow water and greater danger, carrying men out in loads too small for the number waiting. When a large ship was hit or forced to move, those little craft had to turn, scatter, or begin again. A line that had crept forward with patience could lose its reason in a minute. The sea itself became crowded with purpose and fear. Naval ships, transports, civilian vessels, small boats, wreckage, smoke, and men's hopes all seemed to occupy the same grey water. There was no clean path through it. A boat could be heading toward rescue one moment, and away from danger the next. The men on the beach watched every turn, and tried to read their own fate in it. I saw a boat turn back once, low in the water and moving unevenly. Whether it had been ordered away, overloaded, damaged, or frightened off, I did not know. Men near me followed it with their eyes, until it merged into the confusion offshore. No one said much. There are moments when disappointment is too heavy to waste on words. The large ships still mattered. Without them, many more of us would have had no chance at all. They were dangerous because they were necessary, and necessary because the numbers on the beach were beyond anything small craft could solve alone. That was the trap. The things that could save the most men also attracted the worst attention. I find it hard to blame anyone for staring at those ships like salvation, because when a man is trapped on an open beach, he will forgive danger if it comes in the shape of a way home. Yet each ship asked for trust that it would stay afloat. Trust that the small boats could reach it. Trust that the aircraft would miss. Trust that sailors would keep coming back into water where other vessels had already burned. That kind of trust did not feel noble. It felt desperate, thin, and necessary. Some men reached the ships and still did not feel safe. A deck under your boots was better than sand or seawater, but it was not England. Until the vessel moved, until the smoke of Dunkirk began to fall behind, until the sky stayed empty. For longer than a few minutes, rescue remained unfinished. A ship was not safe. It was only the next place where danger could find you. The sight of one burning offshore stayed with us, even after we stopped looking directly at it. Smoke rose from the water as if the sea itself had caught fire. Men who had been waiting for their turn now had to imagine being packed aboard and then thrown back out into the cold. The line did not end. It simply had to believe again. That was why the smaller boats began to seem different. They were not grand, not strong in the way a warship looked strong, and not large enough to take everyone. But they could come closer. They could move where the larger vessels could not. They could appear out of the grey water like something too ordinary to belong in battle. The large ships gave us hope because they could carry many men away, but they also taught us that rescue could burn in full view of the beach. When those great targets became too dangerous, too distant, or too exposed, our eyes began turning towards smaller shapes moving nearer through the water. The strangest sight at Dunkirk was not a warship at all, but little civilian boats entering a battlefield where one bomb could split them open like matchwood. I did not expect to see a fishing boat in a place like Dunkirk. I did not expect a small pleasure craft, a launch, or a civilian boat to come pushing through grey water while smoke hung over the coast, and aircraft still made every man look upward. War had already taken the roads, the harbour, the beach, and the sea. So the sight of something ordinary moving into it felt almost wrong. It was like seeing a piece of life wander into a killing ground. The little boats did not look as if they belonged beside warships and burning transports. Some were narrow, some low in the water, some crowded before they had even reached the men waiting for them. They looked like things for rivers, fishing trips, weekend journeys, quiet harbours, and people who had not expected to measure distance by bombs and drowning. Yet there they were. At first, I stared because I did not fully understand what I was seeing. A large ship made sense to a soldier. It had weight, engines, discipline, and a shape that belonged to war, or at least to serious work. But a small civilian boat, with a man at the helm who might have worn ordinary clothes only days before, made the whole scene feel stranger. It is almost absurd that after armies, tanks, aircraft, and collapsing lines had failed to give us safety, some of our hope arrived in boats that looked too small for a rough afternoon, let alone a war. They could come closer than the larger vessels. That was their value. The big ships often waited farther out, held back by shallow water, danger, damage, or the simple difficulty of taking thousands of men from an open beach. The little boats moved into the spaces. They ferried men from the shallows to larger ships, carried groups away from the beach, and turned the water itself into a chain of desperate movement. That movement did not make the danger disappear. A small boat could be useful because it could approach the shore, but that also meant it came close to the some confusion, and the same frightened men trying to escape. It could be overloaded easily. It could be swamped. It could be damaged by one near miss, or by rough handling from men too cold and tired to climb carefully. Smallness saved it in one way and exposed it in another. I remember seeing one come in low over the water, its shape dark against the grey chop. Men around me watched it the way starving men watch bread. The person guiding it did not look like a figure from a recruiting poster. He looked like a man who had brought an ordinary machine into an impossible place and was trying to make it behave under conditions it had never been made for. A modern person might think of civilian rescue as organised volunteers with radios, training and bright equipment. But at Dunkirk, the line between soldier and civilian became a small boat rocking under too many wet men while smoke drifted over the sea. When one reached us, the order around it had to be strict. Too many men moving at once could overturn the very thing meant to help them. Sailors and officers called groups forward, pushed others back, and tried to keep desperate hands from turning rescue into another disaster. A man could be close enough to touch the side and still be told to wait. That kind of nearness hurt. The boats filled quickly. Men climbed in with stiff legs, wet trousers, heavy coats, rifles, packs and faces that did not yet believe they had been chosen. Some sat packed so tightly that they could barely move. Others crouched low, holding the sides, eyes fixed on the larger ships or the open water ahead. No one looked comfortable. Comfort had left Dunkirk long before the little boats arrived. The civilians and sailors who brought them shared the same danger once they entered that water. They were no longer safely outside the battle, no matter what clothes they wore or what their boats had been used for before. Aircraft did not care whether a hull had once carried fish, families, or weekend passengers. The sea did not care either. I find it hard to forget that quiet courage, because it did not arrive dressed like glory. It arrived soaked, overcrowded, and far too close to being destroyed. Still, there was something deeply moving in it. Not clean, not simple, not cheerful, but moving all the same. Those small boats made the distance between the beach and the larger ships feel less impossible. They did not save everyone at once, and they could not undo the burning port, the broken roads, or the men left behind. But they came. Each arrival changed the faces around us. Men who had stopped expecting much began to watch the water again. A tiny craft could carry only a handful, yet the sight of it suggested that England had not forgotten the beach entirely. That mattered. A trapped man can live for a surprisingly long time on one visible sign that someone is still trying. But courage did not cancel fear. Every trip out could be the last trip. Every overloaded boat had to cross water that was still watched by aircraft and still crowded with danger. The little ships gave us a strange kind of hope, small enough to seem fragile and brave enough to make men ashamed of giving up too early. The little boats changed Dunkirk by bringing ordinary civilian craft into a place where soldiers, sailors, smoke and falling bombs had already made the sea part of the battlefield. But even their courage could not make the crossing safe, because every man carried away from the beach still had to face open water. Aircraft, mines, overload, and the long grey gap to England. Out beyond the sand, the channel would prove that leaving Dunkirk was not the same as surviving it, because men could escape the beach and still die before home came into sight. When the beach began to fall behind us, I expected relief to arrive with distance. For hours, perhaps days, everything in me had wanted to leave that sand, that smoke, that waiting, and that cold line of men staring at the water. Yet once the boat carried us away, the open sea made me feel smaller than I had felt on the shore. Dunkirk was behind us, but safety was not in front of us yet. The deck was crowded, with wet soldiers pressed together in whatever space could hold a body. Men sat, crouched, leaned against railings, or stood with knees loose from cold and exhaustion. Some still held rifles. Some had lost theirs. Some stared back toward France as if they had left part of themselves on the beach. and were waiting for it to call them back. No one cheered in the way people might imagine. A man who has just escaped one danger does not always have enough strength to celebrate before the next one is measured. The sea stretched wide and grey around us, and the ship that had seemed so solid from the beach now felt thin underfoot. We had traded sand for steel, but the sky above us was still the same. Leaving Dunkirk did not mean leaving the war. Aircraft could still find us. Mine could still wait under the water. A mechanical failure, a collision, a sudden attack, or one wrong turn in a crowded route could still finish what the beach had not. It is almost cruel that a man could step off the killing ground and still understand that the road home had simply changed from sand to water. The channel was not a peaceful crossing. It was a working passage under pressure, carrying too many men, too many vessels, too much fear, and too little certainty. Ships moved back and forth because they had to, not because the sea had become kind. The evacuation needed constant motion, and constant motion meant constant risk. Every journey out could become another wreck. Men looked upward more than they looked at the waves. That detail stays with me. The sea could make a man sick, and it did. The cold could make him shake, and it did. But the sky had taught us obedience. Every change in engine sound made heads lift. Every shadow seemed to ask a question no one wanted answered. Some men were sick over the side. Others sat with their eyes closed, not sleeping, only saving what little strength remained. The smell of wet wool, oil, salt, and tired bodies settled over the deck. Nobody had enough room. Nobody had enough warmth. A modern person might think the hardest part of evacuation ends once the rescued are aboard, but our ship felt less like safety and more like a crowded bet placed against bombs, mines, and distance. The smoke of Dunkirk remained visible for a long time. It hung behind us as a dark reminder that the beach had not vanished simply because we had left it. Men turned their heads toward it again and again, though looking back did nothing useful. I did it too. I could not stop myself. There was guilt in that smoke. Every yard of water between us and France made the men still waiting feel farther away and more exposed. Some of us had friends there. Some had officers, sections, units, or men whose names we had heard all week without ever properly knowing them. Rescue made the living quieter, not louder. I remember gripping a rail and feeling the ship move beneath my hands. It was not a grand feeling. It was not a victory. It was the strange fear that came from being carried by something I could not control. On land, a man can at least imagine choosing a direction. At sea, packed among exhausted soldiers, he learns how little his will matters. The sailors kept working. That mattered. Their steadiness gave the rest of us something to borrow. They moved with the practical focus of men who knew fear was present, but had no time to let it become the captain. I find it hard to separate my memory of rescue from my memory of helplessness, because the ship carried us toward England while reminding us that we were still only passengers inside a larger danger. As France faded, hope began to appear, but carefully. No one trusted it too quickly. A man might imagine a harbour in England, a mug of tea, a dry blanket, a floor to sit on without listening for aircraft, then stop himself before the picture became too bright. Hope at Dunkirk had punished us before. The crossing stretched longer than it should have felt. Every minute had to prove it was not the minute when something went wrong. Men stayed silent because silence was easier than naming fears that still had plenty of time to happen. We had escaped the beach. That was true, but truth did not warm us. The channel carried us away from Dunkirk, but it did not give us the clean safety we had imagined while standing on the sand. As some of us moved toward England, Thousands of men remained behind, watching ships leave with other soldiers packed onto their decks. The cruelest sight waiting on the beach was not an empty horizon, but a full vessel pulling away while the men left in the water understood that their own chance had just grown smaller. A full ship pulled away from the shore, and the men left behind watched it grow smaller on the water. No one needed to explain what it meant. That vessel carried warmth, distance, and another step toward England, while the rest of us remained in the cold line with the same wet clothes, the same empty stomachs, and the same sky above us. I remember standing still with one hand tight on the strap of my rifle. It was not that we wanted those men to stay. That would have been a shameful wish, and most of us were not cruel enough to think it clearly. We were glad for them, in the way exhausted men can be glad, quietly and with little strength, but gladness did not stop the other feeling. Each ship that left with someone else made the beach feel more personal. Evacuation had to work by turns. There were too many men for one ship, too many wounded, too much shallow water, too many risks and too little time. Boats could only carry what they could carry. Officers could only call forward the next group, not the whole army. It is almost painful how fairness can still feel cruel when every fair turn sends another man away, while you remain standing in danger. The line did not simply wait, it watched. Men watched the boats fill, watched others climb aboard, watched sailors help the stiff and the soaked, watched decks become crowded with helmets and hunched shoulders. Then the boat or ship moved off, and the watching became heavier. The space it left behind did not feel empty. It felt like proof that rescue existed, but not yet for us. That was the worst part of being delayed. If no ships had come, despair might have settled into one hard shape. But seeing rescue arrive and then leave without you made my mind break in smaller pieces. Hope came close enough to touch, then moved away with the other men on it. A man could survive many kinds of fear, but this one had a bitter taste. Some men tried not to look. They stared down at the water, or at their hands, or at the sand under the surface. Others could not help themselves. I watched because my eyes kept following any movement that might matter. The ship grew smaller, and the faces on it became impossible to see. They were no longer men I could envy properly. They had become distant. Around me, no one celebrated loudly when a vessel left full. The beach was too tired for that. A few men breathed out, as if another load taken away meant the whole machine was still working. Others stood more stiffly, measuring what remained. A modern person might imagine rescue as a simple count of how many were saved. But on that beach, every number saved also left behind men who had to wonder whether the next count would include them. The size of the evacuation made such pain unavoidable. Hundreds of thousands had been caught around Dunkirk, and no single movement could clear them all at once. That truth was reasonable when thought about from a distance. It was unbearable when I felt knee-deep water while a boat turned away. Reason did not warm the body. I remember one man beside me whispering that at least they had got off. He said it as if he were trying to correct his own bitterness before it became too ugly. Then he fell silent again. I understood him. There were feelings at Dunkirk that decent men did not want to admit, because fear had made them selfish for a moment, and then ashamed of being selfish. The waiting wore down the mind more than the body in some ways. Cold could numb the legs. Hunger could become dull. But watching others leave sharpened everything again. It made a man count the boats, count the groups, count the distance to the water, count the men ahead of him, count the time since the last aircraft. It made life feel like a place in a line. I find it hard to judge any man who felt envy there. Because envy at Dunkirk was not about wanting another man's comfort, it was about fearing that his rescue had used up the little luck that might have saved you. That is an ugly feeling, but the beach was full of ugly truths. War not only tests courage, it tests the small private corners of the mind where a man learns what desperation can do to him. The officers kept the lines together as best they could. They had to act as if the next boat would come. Because if they stopped acting that way, the beach might have stopped believing it. Men were told to wait, to hold, to keep order, to move only when called. Those words were necessary. They were also hard to hear after watching another full ship disappear. The sight of the wounded made it worse. Some lay nearby with coats under their heads, bandages darkened by dirt and seawater, faces turned toward the same ships we were watching. They could not step forward when a line shifted. They could not fight their way toward a boat even if panic began. Their waiting was quieter, and because it was quieter, it was more difficult to bear. A healthy man could pretend he still had some control. He could tighten his strap, stand straighter, move when ordered, and tell himself he would last another hour. A wounded man, lying on the sand, had fewer lies available. He waited for others to remember him, carry him, choose him, and make room for him. That kind of helplessness settled over everyone who saw it. The pain of Dunkirk was not only waiting for rescue, but watching rescue carry other men away, while your own place on the beach remained unchanged. That feeling became harder to bear beside the wounded, because they could not push forward, could not stand in line, and could not pretend their turn would come through strength alone. The sand around them would become a hospital without walls, where men bled, shivered, and stared at ships they could not reach by themselves. On the sand, some men could no longer stand. They lay beside helmets, torn straps, folded coats, and bandages that had already picked up dirt before anyone could call them clean. Some had blood, partly covered by sand, as if the beach itself were trying to hide what had happened to them. Others simply stared upward with faces too tired to ask for anything. The beach had been hard enough for those of us still able to walk. For the wounded, it was something worse. A healthy man could shuffle forward when the line moved, brace himself in the water, or lift his pack when ordered. A wounded man had to wait for hands, stretchers, space, timing, and mercy. That made every delay feel heavier. The medical order had become difficult long before we reached the water. The retreat had broken roads, scattered units, filled the area with too many men, and left too few proper ways to move the injured safely. Doctors, stretcher-bearers, and ordinary soldiers did what they could, but Dunkirk did not offer the clean shape of a hospital. It offered sand, smoke, aircraft, and the question of who could be carried first. That was the painful truth of it. The beach was not only a waiting place for men who could still march, it was also a ward without walls, a floor without beds, and a place where pain had to lie in the open with everyone else watching. It is almost unbearable how quickly a soldier can become cargo when the body fails, and every boat has only so much room. Some men were quiet in a way that frightened me more than shouting. Their eyes moved, but the rest of them barely did. Others gripped a sleeve, a strap, a rifle butt, anything close enough to hold. A few asked for water without raising their voices, because even pleading seemed to cost more strength than they had left. We gave what we could, and it was never enough. I saw one man lying on a rough stretcher made from whatever could be found. His coat had been pulled over him, not for warmth alone, but to give him a little privacy on a beach where privacy had disappeared. Another soldier sat beside him and held a helmet above his face to block the glare. It was a small act, almost useless against war, and that made it harder to look at. The wounded changed the meaning of the evacuation. For the rest of us, waiting fear. For them, waiting was pain added to fear. Every boat that filled without them raised a question nobody wanted to speak about. Could they last until another came? Could they be carried through the water? Would there be space? Would they be left because the beach had too many living bodies asking for the same narrow mercy? A modern person might imagine wounded soldiers being moved by ambulances, clean stretchers, numbered beds, and trained teams. But at Dunkirk, a man could lie in sand with a coat over his legs, while the nearest help was a boat that could not yet reach him. That distance looked small from far away. From beside the wounded, it looked enormous. The healthy men carried guilt with them. We wanted to survive, and survival required moving when called. But stepping past the injured made the legs feel dishonest. A man could tell himself he was obeying orders, that the wounded would be taken, that someone had a system. Still, when you saw a face watching you from the sand, those explanations became thin. There were not enough easy choices. If too many wounded were moved at once, a boat might be slowed or overloaded. If they were left too long, pain, thirst, shock, or another attack could take them before rescue arrived. The people in charge had to make decisions that would haunt ordinary men just for witnessing them. Dunkirk forced arithmetic onto suffering. Aircraft made even that fragile care uncertain. When engines sounded, everyone reacted. But the wounded could not flatten themselves quickly or run for a ditch that did not exist. A man who could walk might crouch and curse his luck. A man on a stretcher had to trust others to drag him, cover him, or stay beside him. That kind of helplessness exposed the soul. I find it hard to remember the wounded without remembering the shame of having two working legs and still feeling unable to help enough. You could sit beside someone for a few minutes, share a swallow of water, lift one corner of a stretcher, or call for someone who knew more than you did. Then the line moved, or an order came, or another man needed help, and your small kindness ended before the need did. By then, the whole beach seemed to breathe in pain, not loudly, not always visibly, but steadily. The wounded lay in pockets among the waiting men, reminding everyone that the body was the first thing war collected when plans failed. Guns, trucks, ports and ships mattered. But in the end, it came down to flesh on sand, and whether anyone could carry it away in time. Even the men still standing were beginning to fade. Thirst had cracked lips, hunger had hollowed faces, and sleeplessness made thoughts slow and uneven. We looked at the wounded and feared for them, but we also saw the direction in which all of us were moving if Dunkirk kept taking from us hour after hour. Strength was not endless. It was only being spent more slowly. The wounded turned the beach into a hospital without walls, where pain waited beside helmets, coats, stretchers, and boats that could never come fast enough. But even the men still standing were being worn down by thirst, hunger, cold, and sleeplessness until their bodies began to fail before any bullet touched them. What came after was not a bomb falling from the sky, but the quiet moment when a man realized his wounds, legs, throat, and mind might give out while he was still waiting to be saved. My throat was so dry that swallowing felt like dragging grit down the inside of my neck. In my pocket, there were only a few hard crumbs left, broken from something that had once counted as food before the road, the beach, and my own dirty hands ruined it. When I touched my water bottle, I already knew it was empty, but I lifted it anyway because habit sometimes survives longer than hope. The small silence inside it told me enough. Hunger did not arrive like a dramatic pain. It came slowly, then stayed. At first, A man noticed only that his stomach felt hollow, then that his hands moved more slowly, then that standing up took more thought than it should. Thirst was sharper. The retreat had broken the ordinary things that kept an army alive. Food did not reach the men properly. Water was never enough. Sleep came in scraps too thin to repair anything. We were not only waiting for ships, but we were also waiting while the body quietly spent everything it had stored. That was the danger people do not always imagine. A man can survive bombs and gunfire and still begin to fail because he has been standing too long without water, without rest, and without a real meal. It is almost insulting that after all the noise of war, the thing that could make a soldier fold was his own empty stomach and a dry bottle. Men became slower in small ways. Someone took longer to answer an order. Someone stood staring at the sea after the line had moved. Someone tried to tighten a strap and dropped it twice before getting it right. These were not acts of weakness. There were signs that the body was becoming unreliable. I remember sitting on the sand with my knees drawn up, staring at the water as if staring could make a boat come sooner. My mouth tasted of salt, dust, and old fear. The crumbs in my palm had sand stuck to them, but I ate them anyway, because hunger had made pride smaller than a grain. Around me, men had the same dull look. Faces had lost their shape under dirt, stubble, tiredness, and thirst. Some tried to sleep sitting up, heads dropping forward, then jerking awake when a sound changed. Others kept their eyes open too long, afraid that if they slept, the line would move without them. If you are still here with me in this quiet part of the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you want more slow history like this to keep you company through the night. The frightening part was how exhaustion changed fear. A rested man might run when he heard an aircraft. A starving, thirsty, sleepless man needed one extra second to understand what was happening, and that second could matter. Panic also came more easily. When the body is empty, the mind begins to believe ugly things faster. A whisper can sound like an order. A delay can feel like abandonment. A plane that is still far away can already feel above your head. A modern person might think of exhaustion as needing coffee and a chair, but at Dunkirk, it meant trying to obey orders while your legs shook, your throat burned, and the next movement toward the water might demand strength you no longer had. I saw men who looked almost drunk from fatigue. They swayed when they stood. They blinked too slowly. A simple instruction had to be repeated, because the mind could not hold it the first time. The army was still present, but parts of it were fading inside the men themselves. That did not mean they stopped caring. Most cared desperately. They wanted to live, to reach the boat, to cross the sea, to return home, to avoid becoming other shape left on the sand. But wanting did not create strength. The body has its own rules, and war cannot argue with them forever. There was no grand sound when a man began to give out. He might sit down too heavily. He might stop answering. He might stare at his empty bottle as if some last drop could be reasoned into appearing. I find it painful to remember how ordinary our suffering became, because thirst, hunger, and sleeplessness did not look heroic. They only made men quieter, slower, and easier to break. The beach had many ways to frighten a man, but this one was private. No enemy had to point it at you. No bomb had to fall near you. You could simply feel your own strength thinning until standing seemed like a task from another life. That was when the waiting became dangerous in a new way. By then, every rumour struck harder because we had less strength to resist it. A word about boats coming could lift men for a few minutes. A word about German troops closing in could drain what little steadiness remained. When the body was nearly finished, The mind became easy prey. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion weakened us before bullets or bombs could reach us, turning the weight at Dunkirk into a slow wearing down of the body. But a tired body also made the mind more vulnerable, and every half-heard word on the beach began to feel dangerous. A different kind of attack came after that, because one rumour about ships, Germans, or being abandoned could move through exhausted men faster than any officer could stop it. One man said the ships would come again before night, and another said the Germans were closer than anyone wanted to admit. A third man claimed he had heard that the port was finished, while someone else insisted the Navy had more boats waiting beyond the smoke. None of us knew which voice carried truth and which carried fear dressed up as information. The beach had become a place where whispers travelled faster than orders. Official news came slowly, when it came at all. Officers could tell us to wait, move, hold the line, or keep low, but they could not always explain the whole shape of what was happening beyond the sand. There were too many men in too wide a place, with too much smoke, too much noise, and too many broken roads behind us. So we listened to each other. That was how rumours survived. It filled the empty spaces left by silence. A man who had no map, no radio, and no clear promise from anyone still needed something to believe, even if it was only a sentence passed from one tired mouth to another. It is almost cruel how a few whispered words can become a shelter for one man and a trap for the next. Some rumours gave us strength for a little while. A man would say more ships were coming after dark, and the line would seem to stand a little straighter. Someone would mention a successful lift from another part of the beach, and faces would turn toward the water with renewed attention. Hope did not need much food to stay alive. A small sentence could feed it for another hour. But fear worked the same way. A different whisper could break through the line and hollow men out almost at once. The Germans are nearly here. The boats have stopped. The wounded are being left. The last ship has gone, even when no one could prove these things. They did not have to be proven to cause damage. They only had to sound possible. In a retreat, possibility is enough. We had already seen vehicles abandoned, roads broken, aircraft diving, ships smoking, men left waiting, and the beach turned into a place no one could control completely. So when someone said something terrible, the mind had plenty of evidence to help it believe. The rumour did not arrive in an empty room. It arrived in a room already full of fear. A group of us sat close together on the sand, not quite resting, not quite standing ready. One man leaned forward and spoke low, and the others turned their heads without meaning to. Behind him, smoke rose from the direction of the town, and in front of us, the sea looked too wide for any promise to cross easily. A modern person might think false information is annoying, but on that beach, a rumour could change how a man breathed, how he waited, and whether he still trusted the next order. Sleep became harder when rumours moved. A man might close his eyes for a moment, then hear that boats were arriving elsewhere and jolt awake, afraid he had missed his chance. Another might hear that German troops had broken closer and spend the next hour staring inland, unable to rest or even think properly. The body needed sleep, but the mind kept lifting its head like a frightened animal. Orders became harder to receive too, not because men wanted to disobey, but because rumour had already begun to argue inside them. If an officer said "hold here," a man wondered whether the boats had left. If an officer said "wait," a man wondered whether waiting was another word for being abandoned. If the line did not move, fear supplied its own explanation. That was one of the quiet dangers of Dunkirk. The army still had discipline, but discipline had to compete with uncertainty. Men could stand in line, keep their rifles, obey signals, and still carry a private storm of guesses under the helmet. The outside might look calm for a minute. Inside, everything was being questioned. I find it unsettling to remember how badly we needed the rumours we feared, because as a man trapped between smoke and water will often accept a doubtful hope rather than sit alone with no answer at all. We knew some stories were wrong. We knew some men repeated things only because they had heard them from someone else who had heard them from someone else. Still, when the beach gives you almost nothing certain, even a lie can feel useful until it turns on you. The rumours also made us aware of the other side of the water. England was not only a place on a map anymore. It was the place asking whether we would come back, whether the army would survive, whether fathers, sons, brothers, and whole units would return or vanish into German hands. We did not know what people there were being told. We only knew they were waiting too. That thought changed the size of the fear. Until then, much of my mind had been filled with immediate things: water, food, cold, boats, aircraft, and the next command. But beyond the channel, a country was listening for news that could decide more than the fate of one beach. The rumours around us were small and dirty. The fear across the sea was larger, quieter, and waiting by radios, newspapers, and harbour gates. Rumours on the beach made tired men swing between hope and dread, because every uncertain sentence seemed capable of saving or destroying the little strength we had left. But while we argued with whispers on the sand, England itself was waiting across the channel, unsure whether it was about to receive its army home or lose it almost entirely. Families, officials, and civilians would soon understand that Dunkirk was not only a rescue from France, but the moment Britain had to ask if it still had enough soldiers left to defend itself. On the beach, I wanted only a ship. That was the size of my world by then. A hull close enough to reach, a deck under my boots, a crossing that did not end in fire, and some proof that the sea could carry me away from France. I did not think of Britain as a whole country waiting behind me, but Britain was waiting. Across the channel, people were listening for news in houses, ports, offices, and streets where no one could see the beach, but everyone could feel its meaning. Families wanted sons and husbands back, but the fear was larger than family. If too many of us were captured or destroyed, Britain would not simply mourn an army. It would have to face the next stage of the war, with its shield badly broken. The British Expeditionary Force was not just a collection of tired men in wet uniforms. It was the trained corps that Britain had sent to the continent, and much of it was now trapped around Dunkirk with the sea behind it, and German pressure closing from the land. If that force vanished, the country would lose more than names on a list. It would lose weapons, experience, officers, units, and the confidence that it could still stand in the war. It is almost frightening how a nation can look calm on a map while its future is standing in a line on a beach, waiting for boats. From where I stood, none of that looked strategic. It looked like helmets in rows, men coughing, wet coats, empty bottles, and faces turned toward the water. A man does not feel like the future of his country when his boots are full of sand, and his stomach is empty. He feels like one body trying not to be left behind. That is how history hides inside ordinary misery. Still, every ship that reached England carried more than survivors. It carried trained men who might be formed again into units. It carried officers who knew how to organize, soldiers who knew how to obey under pressure, and men who had seen what the German advance could do. It carried the raw material of resistance. A country cannot fight with speeches alone. I later imagined the English ports in those days, grey with mist, crowded with civilians, officials, sailors, and medical workers waiting for ships to come in from the sea. A ship arriving did not bring celebration first, it brought counting. How many men? Which units? How badly wounded? How many are missing? How much of the army had returned in flesh rather than rumour? Men stepping off those ships must have looked less like victors than wreckage that could still breathe. Wet uniforms clung to them, faces were grey, and many had left rifles, vehicles, guns and friends behind in France. Some were handed tea, blankets, cigarettes, or a place to sit. A modern person might imagine rescued soldiers coming home to instant relief, but those docks must have felt like a place where survival was counted carefully, because the whole country needed to know how much had been saved. That was the twist of Dunkirk. On the beach, rescue felt private. A man wanted his own life back, his own breath, his own chance to sleep without the sky threatening him. But in Britain, each rescued man became part of something wider. The question was not only who had survived. The question was whether enough had survived for Britain to keep fighting. I did not understand that fully while I waited. I only knew that the boats mattered. I knew that a line moving forward was better than a line standing still. I knew that every group taken off the sand meant fewer men left for German captivity or worse. But the larger meaning sat beyond my reach, across the water, in rooms where people feared invasion and read the news with stiff hands. I find it strange now that we were both small and enormous at the same time, because each of us felt like one exhausted man, while Britain looked at us as the remains of an army it could not afford to lose. That is not a comfortable thing to carry. A soldier wants to be brave, but he also wants to be allowed to be tired. At Dunkirk, we were required to be both. When ships came into English ports, they did not erase the defeat in France. They did not replace the equipment abandoned on roads and beaches. They did not bring back the men still holding the perimeter, or the ones already captured. But they gave Britain bodies that could be rested, counted, reorganised, and sent back into the long war that was still ahead. That made every crossing matter. Not in the clean way speeches would later describe, but in the practical way of a country trying to avoid collapse. A man stepping down from a gangway could be shivering, ashamed, hungry, and half asleep, yet his return still mattered. He was not victorious, he was a possibility. Dunkirk became more than a beach, because Britain was not only waiting for men to come home, but it was waiting to learn whether it still had enough of an army to continue the war. But stepping onto English ground did not turn the rescued soldiers into triumphant men, because many carried the beach, the abandoned equipment, and the missing faces with them. The next pain came after Jew, when men were called lucky while they stood on safe ground, feeling as if they had left part of themselves behind in France. I stepped down onto an English harbour with legs that still felt as if they belonged to the sea. But I was not. Around us, people moved with blankets, mugs of tea, stretchers, lists, and careful faces trying to welcome men who looked more like wreckage than an army returning home. Someone called us lucky, and I suppose we were. Luck did not feel clean. My boots were still stiff with salt and sand, my clothes still damp, and my mind still full of the beach. I could see England in front of me, but I could also see the men who had not climbed aboard, the lines still waiting in the water, and the smoke over Dunkirk hanging behind every thought. A man can reach safety and still feel followed. People wanted to help. That made it harder, not easier. A woman handed out tea, and I took it with hands that did not quite know what to do with kindness. A man offered cigarettes. Another pointed us toward where we should go. and someone tried to smile at a soldier whose face had forgotten how to answer. We had been saved, but we had not arrived whole. Survival had a strange weight to it. On the beach, I had wanted nothing except to get away. Once I was away, the wanting did not disappear. It changed into a question. Why me, and not the man behind me? Why this boat, and not the next one? Why this harbour, and not a prison camp or the bottom of the channel? It is almost cruel that a man can spend days begging to be rescued, then feel ashamed when rescue finally chooses him. The newspapers would call Dunkirk remarkable, and perhaps it was. They would speak of spirit, courage, small boats, national effort, and the saving of an army. Those things were not false, but they were not the whole truth either. The truth also had abandoned guns, burned vehicles, wounded men on sand, French roads full of retreat, and soldiers who came home without feeling victorious. I looked down at my boots more than I looked at the faces around me. Sand was still caught in the seams, and that small detail felt more honest than any word spoken at the harbour. The sand said where I had been. It said the beach had not let go. It said that England could receive my body before my mind had finished leaving France. Some men were too tired to speak. Others answered questions with short, flat sentences, then fell silent. A few seemed almost irritated by warmth and concern, not because they were ungrateful, but because gentleness came too late to match what they had just seen. A cup of tea could comfort the hands. It could not explain why other men were still missing. A modern person might imagine coming home from danger as instant relief, but for many of us it felt like stepping into safety while carrying a debt no one had asked us to pay and no one could remove. We had left equipment behind that mattered to soldiers. Rifles, guns, vehicles, stores and heavy gear had been abandoned because men mattered more than metal, yet the loss still carried shame. An army is trained to hold together, to keep its tools, to move with purpose. We had come back alive, but stripped down, soaked, hungry and quiet. We looked less like conquerors than men returned from the edge of being erased. I heard someone say we had been through a miracle. I did not argue. Perhaps a miracle can be wet, hungry, frightened, and full of men who cannot sleep properly afterward. Perhaps a miracle can save a body and still leave the mind standing on a beach. I find it hard to call Dunkirk a victory from the place where I stood, because victory usually lets a man lift his head, while many of us came home looking at the ground. There was relief, of course, I will not pretend otherwise. To feel English ground underfoot after expecting capture or death was no small thing. To breathe without staring at the sky every few seconds was a gift. To know that the channel was behind me and not ahead of me mattered more than I could say. But relief and guilt lived together. A man could sip hot tea and remember cold water around his waist. He could hear kind voices and remember engines overhead. He could lie down somewhere safe and still see a ship pulling away from men who had not been called. Safety did not erase memory. It gave the memory a quieter room. The story people needed would become brighter than the one many of us carried. Britain needed courage, not only grief. It needed proof that it could survive, not only a list of losses. So Dunkirk began to change as soon as it reached home. It became something the country could hold up. For those of us who had stood in the water, it remained something heavier. Coming home from Dunkirk gave us land, warmth and survival, but it did not make us feel like men returning from a clean victory. Behind the bright story of rescue were men still missing, men captured, and men whose names would not fit easily into the legend. The darker side of the miracle was that every ship reaching England also left behind a beach full of faces that the public would never see clearly. When the ship pulled away from the shore, I did not only look toward England, I looked back. The beach grew smaller behind us, but it did not become less real. Lines of men still stood on the sand and in the water, their bodies turning into dark marks beneath the smoke. I could not see their faces anymore. That was the part that the rescue did not know how to explain. A man who was saved could feel the deck under him, the movement of the ship, and the distance opening between himself and France. But behind that distance were others still waiting, others still wounded, others still holding roads, and others who would never reach the water at all. The sea carried us away from them, but it did not make them vanish. No evacuation is clean when too many men need saving and too little time remains. Boats have limits, ships have limits. Tides, aircraft, wounded bodies, broken road, pressure, all make choices before anyone has the mercy to think them through. Some men go. Some men wait. Some men are told there will be another chance. It is almost unbearable that a miracle can still leave men behind, and then ask the survivors to be grateful for the part that worked. The story at home would shine around the saved. That was natural, perhaps even necessary. People needed to see ships arriving, soldiers stepping ashore, tea handed out, blankets wrapped around wet shoulders, and an army that had not been completely lost. But the bright part of the story depended on looking away from the darker edge. Not everyone came home. I kept remembering the men on the beach after our vessel moved out. They were still facing the same sky, still watching the seawater, still waiting for some boat to mean their names instead of ours. Some may have made it later, some may not have. That uncertainty did not soften the memory. It made it worse because the mind keeps returning to every possible ending. Many of the men left behind were not simply unlucky stragglers. Some belonged to units that had held the perimeter, keeping the German advance away long enough for the evacuation to continue. Others were wounded, delayed, separated, or trapped by the confusion of the retreat. They had done what soldiers were told to do. Then time ran out around them. Capture was waiting for many. Prison camps, interrogation, hunger, injury, long years away from home, and the quiet knowledge that the war had continued without them. Others were killed before they could be taken. Some disappeared into the blank category of missing, which is a cruel word because it gives families neither a body nor a clear hope. A modern person might hear the word evacuated and imagine a completed rescue, but Dunkirk was also a list of men whose part in the miracle ended in captivity, injury, or silence. That is why the word miracle always felt difficult to me. I understood why people used it. I understood why Britain needed it. A destroyed army would have been a disaster beyond measure, and saving so many men mattered more than anyone on that beach could fully grasp at the time. But the word had a polished surface. Under it were boots left in sand, men calling for stretcher bearers, and units still buying time with no promise of escape. There was also shame in being unable to remember everyone. A man could carry a few faces clearly, then lose the rest into smoke, distance, and exhaustion. I remembered a man standing knee-deep in water with both hands on his rifle strap. I remembered another sitting near a post, too tired to lift his head. I remembered shapes more than names. That failure of memory felt like another kind of leaving behind. I find it painful that survival can make a man selfish in memory, because the mind protects itself by holding only what it can bear, while the dead and captured deserve more than fragments. At the time, we could not stop the ship. We could not demand that the channel reverse itself. We could not empty the deck and go back for every face. Knowing that did not remove the guilt. Back in England, the public story began to gather strength. The small boats, the courage, the saved army, the national spirit, all of it became part of the way Dunkirk was remembered. Again, those things were true, but truth can be incomplete and still sound confident. The men who did not return made the story harder to tell, so they were often left at the edge of it. The French soldiers especially belonged to that edge. Many had fought to hold the area around Dunkirk while British troops moved toward evacuation, and many faced capture after the operation continued and the perimeter tightened. Their sacrifice was present in the result, but less present in the legend. Britain remembered its boats. I could not separate the rescued from the abandoned. They were part of the same event, not two different stories. Every ship that crossed safely carried relief on its deck and absence in its wake. Every man saved proved that escape was possible. Every man left behind proved that it had never been enough. Dunkirk's darker side was not that the rescue failed, but that the rescue succeeded for many, while others remained on the sand, in the villages, or behind the collapsing perimeter. That truth leads toward the men whose role was often dimmed in the British version of the story, especially the French soldiers who kept fighting while evacuation became legend. Many British lives were saved because French troops stayed in danger long enough to be remembered less than the little boats. There were French soldiers on the roads behind us, holding places most of the men on the beach would never see clearly. While we looked toward the sea, they faced streets, bridges, checkpoints, cell walls, and approach and pressure kept coming. Smoke covered parts of Dunkirk. And beyond that, some men were not waiting for boats in the same way we were. They were buying the time that made our waiting possible. At the time, I did not understand their role fully. None of us understood fully. We knew there was positions still being held, units still fighting, and roads still needing protection, but a tired man on a beach thinks first of the next boat, the next aircraft, the next order, and the next mouthful of water. Gratitude often arrives late because survival leaves so little room for fairness. The evacuation needed a perimeter. That sounds like a clean military phrase, but it meant men staying in danger while other men moved toward escape. British, French, and other Allied troops held the defensive lines around Dunkirk, and without those lines, the beach could have been overrun before enough ships arrived. The sea alone did not save us. The men behind us helped keep the sea reachable, as many French units fought in and around Dunkirk while the evacuation continued. Some of their men were taken off too, but many others were captured after the fighting, and the withdrawal closed around them. Their sacrifice was not a decoration added to the story later. It was part of the structure holding the whole rescue together. It is almost unfair how history can remember the boats more easily than the men who stood in broken streets to make those boats useful. I remember seeing French soldiers in glimpses, not as a full story. A group near a road, a tired face under a helmet different from ours, men behind sandbags or broken masonry, watching the direction from which the Germans might come. They looked as worn as we were, perhaps more so, because they were not only trying to survive Dunkirk, they were watching their own country collapse around them. That is a different kind of weight. We were desperate to get back across the Channel. They were fighting on French ground, in French towns, near French homes, under skies that had already seen too much retreat. For them, Dunkirk was not only an evacuation point. It was another piece of France being lost in front of their eyes. The British version of Dunkirk would later become full of small boats, civilian courage, naval effort, and the return of the army. Those things mattered. I will not take them away, but the danger of a national story is that it can make the memory too tidy. A modern person might imagine history as a balanced record, but memory often behaves more like a crowded harbour, letting the loudest ships be seen first while quieter sacrifices disappear in the smoke. The French did not vanish because they mattered less. They vanished because the story Britain needed Second the will on's survival return and the will to continue the war. A country under threat reaches for the part of a disaster that helps it stand upright. That is human. It is also incomplete. When I think back, I see a French position behind sandbags, smoke lying low across the street, and a road that had to stay closed to the enemy for just a little longer. I see men whose names I never knew holding ground that would not be praised in the same way as a boat crossing the channel. I see the unfairness of being saved by people whose faces fade from the picture. I find it difficult to speak of Dunkirk without thinking that some debts are paid only by remembering them honestly. The British soldiers on the beach owed more than we could understand at the time. Every line that held inland gave the evacuation another hour. Every hour gave another boat a chance to arrive. Every boat carried men who might later say they had been rescued by the Navy, by the little ships, by luck, by weather, by discipline, and all of that could be true while still leaving something out. The French role complicates the comfort of the story. It reminds us that Dunkirk was not only British courage seen from English shores. It was Allied endurance under pressure, French suffering on French soil, and decisions made in conditions where no outcome could be clean. Some men got home. Some men held longer. Some men entered captivity after making survival possible for others. That truth does not make the rescue smaller. It makes it more honest. A beautiful story can become stronger when it admits the parts that hurt. Dunkirk was not a shining line of boats moving through heroic mist. It was a desperate operation held together by sailors, soldiers, civilians, weather, timing, and men in rear positions, who had every reason to fear they would not be remembered properly. By the time the story reached newspapers and speeches, the beach had already begun changing into a symbol. Symbols are easier to carry than mud, smoke, guilt, and missing men. But a soldier who had stood there knew the symbol did not contain everything. It could lift a nation while still leaving shadows underneath. The French soldiers helped keep Dunkirk alive long enough for many British troops to escape, even though their own suffering was often pushed behind the brighter story of boats and rescue. Once that story reached England, it began to harden into a symbol that was cleaner than the beach itself had ever been. The uncomfortable truth ahead is that Dunkirk would be called a miracle, even though the men who lived through it remembered and guns, burning vehicles, and a defeat rescued from destruction. People could call Dunkirk a miracle, and I understood why they needed that word. It was easier to hold than the full truth. A miracle sounded clean, almost bright, as if the sea had opened kindly and carried us home because courage had earned it. But when I thought of Dunkirk, I still remembered abandoned guns, burned vehicles, broken roads, and men who never stepped onto English ground. The rescue saved lives. That had to be said first. Without it, many more of us would have been killed, wounded, captured, or swallowed by the collapse in France. Ships came, little boats came, sailors worked until they were nearly spent, and men who had expected the end found themselves breathing on the other side of the channel. That mattered more than pride, but saving an army from destruction did not mean the army had won. We had been pushed out France, forced back until the continent ended under our boots, and carried home without much of what had made us a fighting force in the first place. The CC had rescued men, not victory. We had left behind equipment that a proper army badly needed: trucks, artillery, ammunition, supplies, heavy weapons, and vehicles remained in France because exhausted men could not carry a war machine across the water on their backs. We came home alive, but lighter in the worst possible way. It is almost strange how a country can cheer because its soldiers survived, while the soldiers themselves remember the sound of leaving their guns behind. A successful evacuation can feel like victory when the alternative is total ruin. That is the hard truth of Dunkirk. It sat between two meanings, and neither meaning was comfortable by itself. It was not a triumph in the usual sense, because we had lost the ground, lost the campaign, and left the continent under German control, but it was not a simple defeat either, because the men were not all lost with it. If you are still walking through this story with me, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you want more slow history like this to stay with you through the night. What made Dunkirk special was not that we won cleanly. We did not. What made it special was that a military disaster near the edge of destruction was pulled back just enough to leave Britain with something to rebuild. The difference between losing equipment and losing the trained men who might fight again was enormous. The first was painful. The second could have been fatal. Britain could replace steel with time, factories, and labour, but trained men who had already faced modern war were harder to replace. Every tired soldier who stepped ashore in England was not just a survivor. He was part of what Britain could still become in the fight ahead. I remember how the body accepted rescue before the mind accepted meaning. A man could drink tea in England and still feel the beach under his boots. He could hear people speak of spirit and courage while thinking of a field gun left useless in France. He could nod when someone called him lucky and still feel the private shame of having survived a retreat. A modern person might imagine survival and victory as nearly the same thing, but at Dunkirk they stood apart, close enough to confuse people and far enough to hurt the men who had lived through it. The newspapers could print the rescue. They could show the return. They could speak of endurance, small boats, and national effort, but they could not easily print the feeling of looking back at the smoke and knowing that the enemy had driven them to the water. The abandoned material told its own story. Vehicles did not come home. Artillery did not come home. Much of the equipment that had given units their shape had been left where the retreat broke down, or where the sea made it useless. Men returned, but many returned without the tools that made them feel like soldiers of a complete army. That mattered in the days after. Britain had to reorganize, rearm, and prepare for whatever might come next. The men rescued from Dunkirk could rest, recover, and be formed again, but the lost equipment could not be wished back by patriotic headlines. The country had been spared a deeper catastrophe, yet it still faced the war with a wounded force. The public needed a story that could hold the nation together. I cannot blame them for that. A country looking across the channel at a powerful enemy does not survive on despair alone. It needs words that help people stand, work, enlist, ration, watch the skies, and believe the war is not already lost. But those words had to be chosen carefully. The newspapers could not simply say we had been beaten and driven into the sea. That would have been too heavy and too dangerous. They also could not lie completely, because the men stepping off the ships carried the truth on their faces, clothes, boots, and silence. So Dunkirk became a careful story. It lifted the rescue while softening the defeat. It gave people something to believe without forcing them to stare too long at the ruined roads in France, the lost guns, the captured men, and the beach after the last ships left. I find it uneasy to remember how quickly suffering can be shaped into a gospel. Because the symbol may help a country survive while still leaving the men inside it feeling misunderstood, that does not mean the story was false. The courage was real. The boats were real. The discipline, endurance, fear, luck, and sacrifice were real. But a thing can be true and still incomplete. For those of us who were there, the two feelings never separated. We were grateful and ashamed, saved and defeated, alive and weakened. The beach had not destroyed us, but it had stripped away the idea that survival always feels noble. Sometimes survival feels like standing among ruins and being told to be proud because the ruins were not worse. Sometimes a nation needs to call that moment a miracle because the other words are too bitter to carry. And sometimes the men who lived through it understand both sides, even while neither side gives them peace. Dunkirk was called a miracle because so many men escaped, but the miracle stood on top of abandoned guns, burned vehicles, lost ground, and the bitter fact that the army had been forced off the continent. That is why the story had to be handled carefully once it reached newspapers, speeches, radios, and homes across Britain. A cleaner public version of Dunkirk would lift a nation while quietly burying the shame, fear, and defeat still carried by the men who came home. In the newspapers, Dunkirk began to sound different from the place I remembered. The beach had been smoke, thirst, cold water, burning ships, and men waiting with fear pressed flat behind their faces. On the printed page, it became cleaner. It had shape, purpose, courage, and a kind of brightness that the sand itself had never possessed. I saw a paper on a table not long after coming back, with the word Dunkirk made large enough to carry more weight than any one soldier could carry. Beside it were my boots, still marked with old sand in the seams. That little picture told the truth better than the headline did. One thing had been made fit for the public, the other still belonged to the beach. I do not think people wanted to lie for the sake of lying. Britain was facing danger across the Channel, and the country needed something stronger than despair. If the story had been told only as defeat, retreat, lost guns, captured men, and an army driven to the sea, it might have broken something already strained. A nation cannot stand very long if every voice tells it to collapse. So the story chose what could hold people up. It spoke of endurance, discipline, little ships, sailors, civilians, and the strange fact that so many men had come back when many had expected none of us to return. Those things were true. I had seen courage. I had seen boats come through danger. I had seen men stand in lines when panic would have been easier. It is almost uncomfortable how the truth can be polished without becoming entirely false, until the painful parts are still present but hidden under a shine people can bear to look at. That was how the Dunkirk spirit began to grow. It became a phrase for not giving in, for ordinary people helping, for the country pulling together when things looked close to ruin. I understand why it mattered. People needed to believe that Britain had not been beaten in its heart, even if its army had been forced off the continent. They needed to think that survival could become strength. But for the men who had stood on the beach, the public story did not always fit properly. It was too neat around the edges. It had no taste of salt in the mouth, no empty bottle, no guilt when another ship left full, no shame of stepping onto English ground without the guns and vehicles left behind in France. It gave meaning to the rescue, but not always room for the private damage. Radio voices made Dunkirk sound firm. Newspapers made it sound proud. Speeches made it sound necessary. Around kitchen tables, people repeated the words because they needed them, and perhaps because those words made the war feel survivable for one more day. A modern person might call it messaging, morale, or national narrative. but to us it felt like hearing our fear turned into a story that helped others breathe more easily while leaving us to carry the parts that did not fit. There was a bitterness in that, but not a simple bitterness. I could not resent a frightened country for needing courage. Civilians had their own fears, even if they had not stood in the water at Dunkirk. They watched the sky, read casualty lists, waited for letters, and wondered whether invasion would come. If our rescue gave them steadiness, then perhaps it served a purpose beyond our own discomfort. Still, the difference between memory and symbol mattered. Memory was untidy. It kept the wounded on the sand, the French soldiers behind the perimeter, the abandoned vehicles, the ship smoke, and the feeling of being saved by chance as much as courage. Symbol was easier to repeat. It took the parts that could inspire and set them in the front window of the nation. I remember looking at those headlines and feeling almost separated from the man they seemed to describe. The paper spoke of endurance, and I remembered wanting water. The paper spoke of resolve, and I remembered watching the horizon like a beggar. The paper spoke of the miracle, and I remembered men who were not included in it. I find it strange that a man can become part of a legend while still feeling mostly like someone who escaped, with wet clothes, empty hands, and too many faces behind him. The public version of Dunkirk helped Britain keep its back straight. That matters. Without morale, factories slow, families lose faith, and fear becomes heavier than bombs. The country needed to believe that retreat had not ended the war. It needed to believe the army could be rebuilt, and that ordinary people could still matter. But the careful story also left questions underneath. Why had the army been trapped so badly? Which decisions had bought time, and which had wasted it? How much had depended on weather, German choices, naval work, discipline, French resistance, small boats, and luck arriving at exactly the right moments? A symbol can comfort people, but it cannot answer everything. Behind every proud phrase was the uncomfortable fact that Dunkirk had balanced on small margins. A delay here, a clearer sky there, a broken defence line earlier, a harbour damaged further, and the story might have ended very differently. That is what stayed with me when the headlines grew confident. We had not been saved by one clean cause. We had survived because many uncertain things held together just long enough. Dunkirk's public story helped Britain stand upright by turning a terrifying evacuation into a symbol of endurance, unity, and survival. But behind that symbol were harder questions about luck, command decisions, weather, ships, rear guards, and the price of every hour bought on the beaches and roads. More frightening was the thought that Dunkirk may have depended not on one great miracle, but on many small chances that could eat have and left the entire army trapped against the sea. When I looked back on Dunkirk, I could never point to one thing and say that was what saved us. It would have been easier if I could. A single brave decision, a single fleet, a single spell of weather, a single line of men holding firm, any one of those would have made the memory simpler to carry. But Dunkirk was not simple. It lived because too many fragile things held together just long enough. The perimeter held long enough. The ships kept moving long enough. The little boats came close enough. The weather, the sea, the organisation, the signals, the sailors, the officers, the men standing in lines, and even the decisions of the enemy all became part of the same narrow chance. Change one of them too soon, and the beach might have become a grave or a prison. That is what frightens me most now. At the time, a soldier does not think in that wide way. He thinks about water, boots, boats, orders, aircraft, and whether he can stay awake until his turn comes. Only later does he begin to understand how many separate things had to work at once for him to be alive. It is almost disturbing how a man can survive by courage, discipline, luck, weather, timing, and someone else's mistake, then spend years pretending he knows which one mattered most. A map made it look tidier than it felt. I saw one much later with lines, arrows, positions, and the curve of the coast set neatly on paper. There were roads we had used, areas we had lost, routes to the beach, and the water between Dunkirk and England. Beside it, a photograph of a small boat looked almost peaceful. My old helmet sat nearby, and that quiet table seemed to understand the war better than speeches did. The map could show direction, but not uncertainty. It could not show a man waiting in cold water while his legs shook. It could not show the feeling of hearing aircraft and not knowing whether the next bomb would fall on the road, the port, the beach, or a ship. It could not show the strange mercy of a cloud, the importance of a working engine, or the cost of one unit holding a road longer than seemed possible. The naval organization mattered. Without ships moving back and forth, there would have been no rescue large enough to matter. The small boats mattered too, because they reached places larger vessels could not. The rear guards mattered because every hour they bought gave another group a chance to leave. A modern person might call it logistics, coordination, and operational timing, but for us, it felt like being kept alive by 1,000 thin threads that none of us could see while standing on the sand. Even the weather had a place in the story. Conditions that slowed attacks, helped movement, or gave ships time could change the fate of men who had no power over the sky. A soldier can obey orders, carry his rifle, keep his place in line, and still depend on clouds, tides, fuel, visibility, and the nerves of sailors he will never meet. That knowledge is humbling. It makes pride feel too small a word. Command decisions mattered as well, though they came to us only as consequences. We did not sit in rooms where choices were made. We felt those choices as waiting, movement, delay, order, confusion, and sudden hope. Someone decided where ships should go. Someone decided what could be held. Someone decided when to pull back and when to keep men in place. I find it unsettling that my life could depend on decisions I had never heard spoken, made by men whose faces I did not know, while I stood with wet clothes and an empty stomach. Luck was there too, whether people liked admitting it or not. One bomb fell elsewhere, one boat returned, one engine kept running, one line did not break, one rumour did not become panic. One unit held longer than expected. One man was called forward instead of another. Dunkirk was full of such little margins, and each margin had human lives balanced on it. That does not make courage meaningless. It makes courage more honest. Courage did not replace luck, organisation, weather, naval effort, French and British resistance, or discipline. It worked beside them. Men still had to stand, wait, carry the wounded, steer boats, return under threat, hold lines, and keep moving when the body wanted to stop. Courage was one part of the machine, not the whole machine. By the end, the lesson was not that miracles arrive cleanly. It was that survival can come from many imperfect pieces holding together in the final usable moment. Dunkirk was saved from becoming a total catastrophe, but only barely, and that bare margin is where the truth lives. We were not rescued because the world became kind. We were rescued because not enough things failed at once. Dunkirk survived because many small chances held together. From the perimeter and the ships to the weather, the boats, the orders, and the tired men who kept discipline when panic would have been easier. After all of that, the lesson was not simply whether Dunkirk was a victory or a defeat. but what it means for human beings to live when nearly every road has closed behind them. The final memory is an old soldier holding a worn helmet with faded sand still inside it, understanding that he was not saved from defeat, but from being erased. I remember Dunkirk not as a heroic painting, but as sand inside my boots, cold water around my knees, and faces waiting for ships in a silence that seemed too heavy for any beach. Years later, people could speak of it with polished words, but memory did not polish itself so easily. It came back in small pieces, a wet sleeve, a cracked lip, a smoking harbour, a man staring at a boat that had no room left for him. That was how Dunkirk stayed with me. People often need softer names for disasters. They need words like miracle, spirit, endurance, and rescue, because those words help the living carry what happened without being crushed by it. I understand that now more than I did when I first came home. A country under threat needs a language that keeps its hands steady. But there is danger in making the story too clean. If Dunkirk is only called a miracle, then the fear disappears from it. The hunger disappears. The wounded men on the sand disappear. The French soldiers holding the perimeter disappear. The abandoned guns, burned vehicles, and men who never came home become shadows behind a brighter word. It is almost too convenient how history can make survival look beautiful once enough time has passed to hide the trembling. Dunkirk did help Britain continue the war. That is true. And it matters. The army was not destroyed on the beaches. Many trained men were brought back, rested, reorganised, and used again in a war that had not finished with France. Britain kept something it could rebuild from. But Dunkirk did not erase the defeat in France. It did not turn retreat into victory. It did not bring back the equipment left behind or the prisoners taken after the perimeter collapsed. It did not remove the shame many men carried when people called them brave. It only gave them life. That difference is small on paper and enormous in memory. Being saved from defeat is not the same as being saved from being erased. We had not won our way home. We had been carried out of a closing trap before the door shut completely. A modern person might imagine survival as a clean ending, but for many of us, it was only the beginning of learning how to live with what had been left behind. I kept my old helmet for years. It sat quietly in a corner, scratched, dull and ordinary to anyone who did not know where it had been. Sometimes, when the light was grey by the window, I would look inside and imagine there was still a trace of Dunkirk sand caught somewhere in it. Perhaps there was. Perhaps I only needed to believe that something small had come back with me because so much else had not. A man grows older, and people expect his memories to become simple. They ask whether he was afraid, whether he felt lucky, whether the little ships were as moving as everyone says. The answer to all of it is yes, but yes is too small. I was afraid. I was lucky. The boats were moving. The beach was terrible. The rescue was real. The defeat was real too. I find it painful but necessary to hold both truths together, because Dunkirk loses its meaning if we turn it only into glory or only into failure. It was a disaster that did not finish its work. It was a retreat that preserved life. It was a humiliation that gave Britain another chance. It was a place where men waited in fear, and still somehow kept enough order for rescue to happen. That is the lesson I would leave behind. Dunkirk was not beautiful because it was perfect. It was not moving because everyone was saved, or because the suffering made sense, or because history had arranged itself kindly. It was moving because human beings, trapped between smoke and water, still found a way to keep life from being completely swallowed. Some men held roads. Some steered boats. Some waited in lines. Some carried the wounded. Some stood in cold water until their legs shook. Some came home and never found the right words. Some did not come home at all. A story like Dunkirk should make room for all of them. So when people call it a miracle, I do not always correct them. I only wish they knew what the miracle was made of. It was made of fear, exhaustion, discipline, luck weather, smoke, courage, shame, small boats, hard choices, and men who understood that survival could still feel unfinished. That is not a clean legend. It is something heavier and more human. Dunkirk was the story of an army not rescued from defeat, but rescued from being wiped away completely. That narrow difference gave Britain men and the possibility of continuing a war that still had many dark years ahead. And for those of us who stood on that beach, it left a memory that never sounded like victory, but still felt like life refusing to disappear. Thank you for staying with me through this quiet journey across the smoke, sand, and cold water of Dunkirk. Let the story rest now, let the sea grow distant, and let the men on that beach fade gently into the silence of the night. Good night, sleep well, and I will see you again in another slow walk through history.